So MMA Fighting here with Jon Anik, UFC's play-by-play man. John, this has been quite a week for you, and you said in your statement that you learned a lot. Can you talk to me a little bit more about what you learned?
Yeah, quite a bye week for me and not by design. I guess I learned, despite the fact that I pride myself on being a man of the people and maybe more importantly, a fan of the people, that talking about the fans is not really something that there's a ton of upside in. And I really chalk this up as nothing more than a moment on my podcast. I didn't think anything of it until I woke up the next day, and a lot of media outlets are reaching out and repurposing, at times sensationalizing my comments and asking if I want to clarify anything. So it took on a life of its own. And I think anybody in the public eye, as a public figure to whatever degree, comes across these learning lessons at times. And I think it's what you sort of do going forward. But I think for me, as a play-by-play guy, when there are myriad allegations of bias or people suggesting that there's a lack of objectivity, I got sensitive to that, but I shouldn't, like I'm certainly not sensitive to personal attacks and things like that. I really need to not be sensitive to allegations of bias, because 95% of the fan base felt like it was an even call, and actually felt like at least half the fan base felt like Dracus du Plessis won the fight. But, as Bill Belichick would say, it kind of is what it is. And as one of my ESPN radio colleagues texted me, there ain't no rainbows without some rain. So it is what it is. Thankfully, I have the support of the UFC. And I guess most importantly, I have the support of the roster, thankfully. I spent most of my time over those 72 hours engaging with fighters and thanking them privately for their support. So I feel the love from the roster and certainly the fan base. And the roster especially is the most important thing.
Mm-hmm. How do you feel like your comments were sensationalized?
Well, I think you can take a headline and even just write a quote, and it can look as though it's attributed to me. And so I thought that there was that in some instances, but I'm not certainly looking not to come down on anybody. I said what I said, and we're judged on every utterance on an 8-hour live telecast 25 times a year for me, right? And Dominic Cruz and I talk about that all the time. There are so many opportunities to perjure yourself on a live microphone. And I think when I have a podcast, I maybe let down that fourth wall at times and really let my intimate audience in. And obviously that audience is growing, and your comments can be repurposed. But no, I need to own the comments. And, I'm thankful that I've established enough goodwill with 90% of the fan base that, this wasn't a fireable offense, my man.
I think one of the reasons why you do have so much goodwill is that you call it down the middle, like for better or for worse. That's my perception of your reputation in the space. You're a guy who tries to play it down the middle and play it as fair as possible. Do you think in this day, with all the polarization in our world, do you think it's getting harder and harder to play it down the middle when it comes to your role?
It's a great question. Not for me. I would never take myself out of a broadcast booth, even if Cruzy was fighting, right? Because as soon as he hits that tunnel, all of those emotions are gone. Bilal Muhammad is one of my best friends in the world. He's done a podcast with my twin brother for years, but the call that I'm most known for is his potential next opponent, the champion Leon Edwards. And I'm supremely close with his manager, Tim Simpson. So what I find is that there are legitimate interpersonal relationships on both sides of these fights more often than not. And just a lot of connective tissue in terms of my relationships with coaches. So I feel the love in terms of me out to these fighters, oftentimes on both sides of the fight. And even though I'm hopeful that Bilal Muhammad will get his championship opportunity, I'm also hoping that Leon Edwards will stamp himself one of the greatest welterweights of all time, by fighting and potentially beating a guy like Bilal. So I really feel that my heart is torn. But once they hit the tunnel, Steven, all that stuff goes out the window, and I'm focused on calling a live sporting event. And if I got to, criticize Dominic Cruz, then I'm not afraid to do that.
So you talked about the negativity that permeated your feed after this particular fight. To what do you attribute that rise in negativity?
I think there are a lot of passionate fans who felt like Sean Strickland won the fight. And it doesn't really behoove me to get into some sort of long-winded conversation about this, if I'm being totally honest, but I just think in this situation, there were a lot of animated Sean Strickland fans, and I respect those people. I think some of us in the MMA space feel like X has maybe gotten a little bit more angry over the last 12 to 18 months. There have been a lot of high profile broadcasters and fighters who have completely disengaged from that website. I don't want to do that. I want to be a conduit for the fans. I want to make these people feel good by following them back when, we have a constructive back and forth, right? If I can make someone's day by replying or following them back, I want to continue to engage in that space. So as I have talked to, my bosses at ESPN and the UFC over the last 72 hours, one thing that I am not going to do is post and ghost, right? And in order to let the good in, maybe you got to take a few personal shots, but I'm truly okay with that. I think my skin is far thicker than maybe I let on in that emotional moment on the Anik Flooring podcast.
Yeah. Right. Nice pitch at the end. Yeah. So do you, what's the plan here going forward? I mean, for you said not post and go. So what does that mean effectively? Like you're just going to try not to engage particular things, or you're going to look at it in a different way? How do you do what you need to do and save your sanity, essentially?
I can still have valuable, productive discourse with people who suggest that I'm on the wrong side of a fight, as long as it doesn't sort of get into the nastiness. So I'm really not going to change much. I think there might be a little bit more thoughtfulness in terms of my engagement or selective engagement, but I still plan to be omnipresent on X and engaging and following these fans, right? I mean, go look at the people I follow. It's a lot of mixed martial arts fans because I'm trying to make their fucking day, and they deserve to have a back and forth with somebody who is a figure in the space. So I don't think anything is really going to change. Obviously, I've had several instances, I think, on my podcast over the years where, I've learned a lesson or maybe walked right up to a line but not crossed it. So I just have to be aware that, my comments, might have a little bit more weight than initially I thought.
And I know you mentioned this to Scott Fontana at the Post, but your contract runs till 2026. The plan for you is to stay with the UFC. You are not going anywhere, right?
Yeah, I'm a full-time employee right now. I hope they extend my contract at the end of this contract, October 2026. If you want the exact date, I'll be 15 years in, man. This is my life's work. So I'm not going to be that guy who sticks around forever and prevents a young guy from getting an opportunity. I'd be very surprised if I'm doing this into my 60s, even if it is the greatest job on earth. But I have no intention of leaving in 2026. I think for a guy like me who grew up a New England Patriots season ticket holder in the 1980s when they were the laughingstock of the NFL, there will always be that NFL pull. But I don't know if I can say it any more clearly. I have the job I want. And every Saturday night, I can assure you I got to earn it, because they can terminate me without cause at any time.
Yeah, exactly. Well, just to clarify, like, is if you did not go to the NFL, would you consider your life's work to be complete? Would you consider the journey to be complete? Or is the NFL kind of where you see yourself ending your career?
It's a great question. And I think the last time I called a college football game in 2015, maybe I wish I didn't have as much fun as I did, but there is no live event like a UFC telecast. So I think I would be contented if I never got the opportunity to call an NFL football game. There are a lot of great American broadcasters who have not been afforded that opportunity and have gone balls to the wall trying to get it. So I would like to check that box at some point in time, but not at the expense of my UFC job.
The UFC talks about free speech a lot. That's been sort of like a headline in the community, from Dana's reaction to a lot of the controversy that have come up with fighters recently, things that they've said. He constantly, portrays the UFC as a sort of like a bastion of free speech, a place where fighters can say what they want and not face any repercussions. Where do you stand on that issue? And do you think that there's any different standard for you guys, for the commentators, when you talk on your platforms?
Great question. I am so thankful that there is not a double standard, right? And even if you look at some of my tweets wondering aloud why a certain man or woman maybe isn't getting a title fight, right? Some people might think, why would the lead play-by-play voice of the UFC be uttering that in a public space? But I have never been muzzled. I have never been censored. And when I talked to my boss, Craig Borsari, about all of this, there was nothing suggestive coming out of his mouth. It was all support. So I'm very thankful that even when my opinion maybe disagrees with the promotion, that they still allow me to voice my opinion, because I try to do it in a thoughtful way and a respectful way. And that's why I think maybe that I am afforded that leash. But that's one thing that I am supremely grateful for, because from day one, I remember Dana White pulling me into his office saying, "We didn't hire you to be Joe Rogan or Mike Goldberg or anybody else. We want you to be you." And that's held true since January 20th, 2012. A lot of people look at my statement as some sort of UFC led impulsive decision, and it certainly was not that.
Yeah, it is kind of a Rorschach test. I found in that, in like the reaction to it, it seems like a lot of people bring their own perspectives and their own histories, their own past, their own biases to the response to your statement and what you said before on the podcast. It's really been an interesting thing for me to see the reaction to it. But I'm
Well, and
probably
even
gonna
me
cut-
sitting down and talking to you, right? The
yeah,
UFC certainly could be like, dude, don't do any media, right? But that's
right,
not who I am, right? And I tell my daughters all the time, like, the truth will set you free.
yeah.
And sometimes I'm speaking the truth at my own peril, but it's hard for me as sort of a truth teller to change who I am, and that's why I'm talking to you today.
Where are you at in the process of your pre-fight prep? What's next on your agenda? And can you talk a little bit about the workflow on bye weeks such as this? Although it's been obviously not the usual bye week.
So it's interesting because as soon as you start talking about fight prep, I feel anxiety come over me. I have no anxiety about some of this stuff that we've been talking about. But as soon as you talk about my next show, UFC 298, I think about the fighter card library behind me of 2,500 fighter cards. And I got to get the UFC 298 fighters out of there and start making the new cards. But my process essentially starts about 11 or 12 days out. I voice all the in-arena stuff, and then I start breaking down the fighters. Show format, all the writing for television happens mostly during fight week. I try to focus on fighter prep, which is my number one source of anxiety, with 28 fighters on a card. But right now I'm in a pocket where I have essentially 2 weeks off before the pay-per-view, right? That won't be the case in March, where I work a fight night March 2nd. And then during that fight week, I'm voicing March 9th, UFC 299 in Miami. So being afforded this extra prep time is outstanding. I will certainly make the most of it. But yeah, we start voicing the show about 10 days out, and I take advantage of every single hour. I don't turn the television on in the hotel, not one time, because as I always say, if the fight card somehow got delayed 5 hours because of a power outage, there's always one more Sean Woodson video interview you can ingest, or one more piece of film you can watch. I think the process is, it's so open-ended and unending that I can always make use of the time. But it's a lot, man. There's no doubt about it. Those pay-per-views are absolute beasts.
Given its significance, have you started any work on 300 yet?
No, I mean, I can't even think about that right before I get through UFC 298. Every one of these pay-per-view weeks is just a huge endeavor and initiative, and a lot is asked of me during those weeks. I have some other hosting obligations, but there's just a lot of media. Oftentimes when my man Joe Rogan's not there, I'm emceeing 2 separate weigh-ins. So I really can't think about UFC 300 before I get to UFC 299. I haven't even thought about what my pay-per-view open would be for UFC 300. If I was going to give anything some forethought, it would be, how do you sort of write an open that is not just main event focused, but also UFC focused for 300. So maybe you're right. Maybe I should give that some thought. But first things first, Ilya Topuria, Alexander Volkanovski coming up mid-February in the Big A.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for your time, John. I really appreciate it.
My brother, thank you.